First, there's a reminder of an old story. That story about the Buddhist seeker whose soul had been inflamed by reading of the great saint Ashoka. So he had a longing to see and meet with Ashoka. So he decided that he would go to the high mountains to meditate, to chant the sutras, and to invoke this great God. He sat there day after day, chanting, invoking, meditating, for 12 long years. And after those 12 years, he felt disheartened. Not a wisp of a sight of Ashoka had he seen. So he decided to descend the mountain and give up his quest. But as he was walking down the road at the bottom of the mountain, he saw an old man shoveling at the bottom of a mountain. And he asked the old man, "What are you doing?" And the old man said, "This mountain is blocking the sun from my house, so I'm removing the mountain." And the seeker thought to himself, why, in a multitude of lifetimes, this man would not achieve his goal, and I have given up only after a short number of years. So he returned to his mountain cave and resumed his incantations, his chanting, his meditation, his invoking for another 12 years. And again, disheartened, not a sight of Ashoka had he seen, he decided to descend the mountain, giving up his quest once again. But along the road, he saw a man sitting out the front of his house with a bar of iron. And he asked this man, "What are you doing?" The man said, "I'm a tailor, and I have need to make a needle." The man looked at him and thought again, he will never achieve his task in many a life. And look at me, I've abandoned my quest after a few short years. So he returned to the mountain once again resuming his invocations, his chanting, his meditation. And again, after another 12 years, not a wisp, not a sight. His heart sank. It seemed that he'd failed his quest. But when he came down the mountain and he was walking along the road into town, suddenly he saw on the side of the road a dog, its body being consumed by maggots, unable to stand or walk because of its disability, being eaten away, but still barking at every passerby, every cart that passed him. And as the seeker stood, a great wave of compassion rose up in him. After all, one of those things that he'd been chanting all of those years in the sutras, non-himsa, non-hurting, compassion. And so this great wave rose up in him, and he thought he must alleviate this dog's suffering. But because of the law of non-himsa, non-hurting, he could not hurt the maggots. either. What could he do? The only recourse for him was to remove the maggots from the dog's body with his tongue. He knelt down beside the dog, but because of the stench and the horror in front of his eyes, he closed his eyes before bending down to use his tongue to remove the maggots from the dog's body. But as his head bent lower and lower, instead of feeling the abhorrent taste of maggots on his tongue touched sand. And as he opened his eyes, an amazing thing happened. A great effulgent light appeared before him, and in that effulgent light was the clear form of his chosen ideal, Ashoka. The man was greatly surprised, but out of his mouth came the words, "But why? Why? I was on that mountainside for so many years, and you did not appear to me." And Ashoka spoke to him and said, "On the mountainside you were burning your karma, but in this final act of compassion, you have removed the veils which have kept me from your sight. But if you do not believe that I am real, put me on your shoulder and take me into town." And this is what the seeker did. Taking this effulgent light, in which Ashoka was clear to his vision, he walked into town, and to each person he approached, he asked them, "What do I have on my shoulder?" And they all looked at him as though he were mad, and hurried on their way, except one old woman whose karma had been burnt to a sufficient degree that she said to him, "All you have on your shoulder is the carcass of a riddled dog." The second story is the story of a very old monk who lived in a monastery at a time long ago in the land of the rising sun. And one evening, after the evening repast, all the monks were gathered amongst a group of visitors, travelers who had stopped at the monastery for refreshment and hospitality. And the monks were listening to the stories of the travelers, and the topic of their stories was pirates. And suddenly, the old monk, when there was a lapse between the stories, he said, "Let me tell you my story." He said, "In my youth, I had wealth. I had women, I had bounty, because I was a pirate. I sailed the 7 seas. I was called the king of the oceans. With my band of marauders, we pillaged many a ship. But then, one day, a strange vessel came up alongside of our ship, and it could clearly be seen that the captain of this ship was a handsome young man. And up on the mast sat a young monk chanting the sutras. But because this ship tailed us, even though I maneuvered to get out of its way, it continued to follow us. So I came alongside and shouted to the captain, and the captain responded, "We're afraid of pirates, so we thought we would come alongside of you for protection." Well, I thought to myself, what fools they are. But it could clearly be seen in the cabins that there was bounty. One could see chests that were obviously filled with good things. So I laughed up my sleeve, as did all of my companions, waiting for the moment when we could board her and claim our bounty. Well, the chance came as we moored for the night at a small cove, and my companions could hardly wait to get on board to start claiming the goods that could be seen there. So we boarded this vessel, and the chests were taken out, and the women were thrown overboard, and the men were thrown overboard. But the captain beseeched me, looking into my eyes, "Please save my life. I'm on my way to see my mother who is dying. Please let me finish my journey to complete with my mother." "Toss him overboard," I said. And so he was thrown with the rest over the side, as was the young monk sitting in the mast. I had a momentary thought of this monk as he entered the water, and so I watched. And as I watched, this young monk, who was clearly drowning, was holding the sutras that he had in his bag on his shoulder, high above himself in the water. And as I watched, he would not drown. I observed as he bobbed on the water, his arm raised above his head, and unlike all the rest, he did not sink under the waves. We took poles and poked him so that he would descend to his watery grave. But he did not. And as I looked, I saw several golden children, one holding up his arm, and another holding up his head. I could not believe my eyes. I blinked and blinked, And then, deep inside of myself, a great wave of compassion arose, and not being able to help myself, I reached out with a pole to the young monk. When I pulled him aboard, and he knelt and thanked me for his life, I asked him, who were the golden children who were with you? He said, I don't know any golden children. But the young monk said, I have been chanting the sutras since I was 6 years old, and I did not mind drowning, but I wanted to keep the sutras dry as long as I could, and I felt that my arm was so light, as was my head. And I asked the young monk, do you still want to go to your destination? Because it had been discovered that he was going there to be ordained. The young monk replied that he did not. He wanted to go back to his own place, to his own master, to his own monastery. And almost without knowing, I asked him, may I come with you? And so I traveled with this young monk here to this place where I have been ever since. I cannot forget the deeds of my past. I cannot forget the golden children, and I have been chanting the sutras ever since. What similarity do you see? Do you feel that is evoked in you from these stories? What is it about our own life that brings us to the place where we see the connections, we understand the relationships? What's the similarity between these two stories? For the answer, we have to look to our own lives, our own story. What's the commonality between these two tales?
running the karma, but they do it on a reverse
way.
One just burn his karma and the veil is lifted, and the other one is the veil just going away, and then after it's burning his karma.
His karma, yes. Right.
I think they see with their heart in that moment.
Right.
And their mind is...
And haven't we had that experience? That there's something arisen that's stronger than the conditioning, whatever the past had been, whether it be bloodthirsty or doing good. Something happened. But food for contemplation, because it has to do with this talisman that we were exploring, the meaning of the talisman. So we'll see where it leads us.